Delighted to be here with Fiona, who, as Arabella says, is the, regional director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Economist Intelligence Unit. So let's start with economics. The IMF, as I'm sure you know, predicts some sort of steady growth across the key Latin American economies in the next few years. What's your take on how that trend might continue?
I think if you look at Latin America on aggregate, that is correct. And our view is broadly in line with what the IMF is saying. And we're moving into a period of steady, albeit unspectacular growth in Latin America. We've seen Latin America emerge from a difficult period of pro-cyclical fiscal and monetary adjustment in response to a drop in commodity prices and weaker demand from China in particular. That was very difficult, particularly for South America's commodity exporters. So we saw really Latin America had a difficult period between 2015, 2016, and early 2017.
Sorry, I'll just stop you. I think that you'd have a slide on this, in fact.
I do actually. I have to say that I love numbers, I love statistics, and I love graphs. So I've managed to get some slides into this conversation. So I think that it's better for me to illustrate all of the points that I'm saying to you here via this slide. So again, on aggregate, we're moving away from this period of difficult adjustment, and it is a positive picture overall. But one thing that I want to point out is that we are facing some global headwinds, and that's already become evident this year in some volatility. But I think that we are potentially looking at some more global headwinds based on our own view that the US and China will both be slowing, particularly in 2020. But the other thing that I want to point out is, although, the IMF is correct, moderate rates of economic growth for Latin America, it's more complicated than that. And there's a lot of difference depending on what economies you're talking about. And that's really what I wanted to show in this slide, is that variation in the region and what's happening in the region. And I think that what you can see at the moment is a lot of Latin America's big economies are struggling. So you can see this isn't a comprehensive chart. It doesn't, for example, include Venezuela, which we expect to contract by 15% this year. For you to get your bearings, this is 2018, so the dark blue, it's in order of weakest growth to strongest growth in 2018, for you to get your bearings. So what you can see is, Argentina and Brazil struggling, Mexico also growing relatively weakly, but over here, we do have some very fast-growing economies in Latin America that represent really solid opportunities, and a lot of them are focused in Central America, but there are also a lot of other interesting opportunities. For example, some of the Pacific Alliance economies, Peru in particular, Chile, Colombia, we expect them to be growing at strong rates on the basis of relatively solid commodity prices. So there are certainly opportunities. These are, of course, smaller markets. So despite the fact that these economies are growing more slowly, and partly that's structural because they're more advanced, they have higher GDP per head, so you would expect them also to be growing a little bit more slowly. Because of their size, they're markets where investors and global companies want to be in order to gain market share. So for example, in Brazil, we see really strong levels of FDI, even throughout that very deep recession in 2015, 2016. So I think really you have to pick your market, and in particular sectors, there will be places in Latin America that you'll want to be, despite the fact that overall it's not growing at super robust rates. The other thing I just want to point out here is that you can see that there will be headwinds, and overall for most economies we do expect that growth will be weakening slightly in 2019, but particularly in 2020, as I said, reflecting weaker growth in the US. And we can see that there are a lot of challenges and risks associated with that, and a lot of obstacles for policymakers.
Sure. So as you mentioned, global headwinds are going to be a challenge across the board. Are there particular challenges for LATAM given those wins?
Absolutely, and I think for emerging markets in general, and I think the question is how Latin America performs in the face of those challenges, those risks, those tighter global liquidity conditions. And I have a couple more charts. I'm not sure who's working the system. Here we go. So I think in our assessment, actually, Latin America has performed extremely well this year in response to tighter global liquidity conditions. And what I would say in terms of this shift in investor sentiment, in good times, in times of increased risk appetite and search for yield, I think that portfolio investors, those private external creditors for Latin America, look at a range of issues. So they might look at what we call point-in-time indicators. So they might look at the numbers, but they'll also look, for example, at the policy direction and what they think the numbers might be saying in a few years' time, if there can be policy improvements, they'll also look at the politics. But in these times of a risk aversion, what you see is they focus on the numbers. And I think that's what I wanted to point out here is really the key numbers, and the easiest way to assess an emerging market's vulnerability to tighter liquidity conditions is via the fiscal balance and the current account balance. And in this situation of where the question is, can Latin America access dollars? It's particularly about the current account. So I think we can see that there are some economies here that have high current account deficits and not a lot of FDI to cover those deficits. And you can see, for example, there aren't that many, but Argentina and Bolivia stand out here. And then there are some others with larger fiscal deficits. But again, the real pressure has been on these countries with high current account deficits. But really, if you look at CDS swaps or other measures of credit risk, actually Latin America has fared really well because for the most part, current account deficits are moderate. And where those current account deficits are larger in Latin America, they're actually matched by substantial high or even high FDI inflows. So really, Latin America hasn't been vulnerable in that sense.
But you touched briefly there on policy development. So my instincts as a sort of political advisor are always to think more about policy perhaps than liquidity and FDI and so on. And it strikes me that the opportunities for policy development currently in Latin America are enormous. It's been a year of, I lose count of how many elections, but Cuba, Chile, Brazil, and elsewhere have all had large elections this year. What's your take on the future of the opportunities for policy? Where do new and existing governments go from here? And how does that affect the landscape?
I think there are huge opportunities. It's been a very important election year. It's not over yet. And don't forget, there's more to come in 2019. There are lots of very important elections happening next year. So this is a time of substantial change in Latin America. And I think that, apart from the macro, these micro structural reform policies that we have, for the most part, not seen a lot of in Latin America over the course of recent years are really important in order to boost those growth rates and increase productivity, because certainly over the long term, that's what we'll need to see to support growth. So the political and therefore the policy environment is extremely important. And one thing that I want to point out is that for us, the challenge in Latin America is not political stability, because in our models of the business environment, which includes an assessment of politics in Latin America, it's not more unstable than other emerging markets. But I think where we do see a weakness in Latin America historically is in policy effectiveness. And that has to do with measures of transparency, accountability, corruption that we measure, but also just related to policy effectiveness. So we've seen legislative gridlock in systems, presidential systems, but with proportional representation in Congress. So you have to construct these very complex legislative alliances in order to pass legislation. So I think going forwards, that's what we'll want to see, is whether or not these new governments can harness Congress in order to make progress. And I think in a lot of countries, they've made the right diagnosis about what needs to be done, just about what they can do.
Yeah. How important, you touched there on productivity. Do you have an assessment of certainly where is Latin America in terms of its productivity, and what steps are being taken to boost it? I've heard it said that obviously we're aware that a lot of the growth is the growth is happening, but that may be in some part due to a growing population. So it's a sort of natural effect of that rather than productivity increasing per se. Do you have a take on?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, Latin America has been benefiting from a demographic dividend. Some countries in Latin America over the course of the past 20 decades have also benefited temporarily from a stabilization dividend. And, macroeconomic stability is important for growth, and good demographics is important for growth, but it's not sufficient for growth. And I think the best way to respond to that is to look at what people will be talking about today. So what's required is investment in those sectors that are potentially a bottleneck to growth in Latin America. In particular, I'm thinking about logistics and infrastructure, but also about energy. So I think that as the minister pointed out, there are strong needs for finance, for development in those areas. And that is what is, that is a big part of what is required in Latin America to boost productivity. But in order to attract that investment and to make sure that that investment produces results in terms of higher value added, higher productivity, and better outcomes for voters, we also need to see those micro reforms. So we need to see more progress on labor reform, particularly on tax reform in Latin America, which is a real challenge and something that we measure as a weakness in Latin America. There are other things where other areas where Latin America has performed extremely well, in trade, a general policy towards private investment and foreign investment. So there are some positives, but there are certainly some weaknesses, I think, that need to be addressed in terms of infrastructure, tax policy, labor market reform, and also in some countries in terms of financing.
So those things, of course, will change or will be different in terms of their priorities and their needs from country to country. But I know, talking to you beforehand, you had a couple of particular, let's say, case studies of Argentina and Brazil. So perhaps, and there's also, I think, some more slides on this. If you want to perhaps talk some more specifically about those two countries in which I believe your unit sees a great deal of interest, that might be instructive to get a handle on those kind of questions. Yeah,
absolutely. Over recent weeks, we've had more interest in Brazil and Argentina for obvious reasons than in any other country in the region. So briefly, I can talk about our view for those two very important countries, which you can, in the previous slide, you saw that they're undergoing, growth challenges at the moment. So I'll tackle Brazil first. So I want to look at it maybe in a more structural way.
Right.
And so I just want to look at its strengths and its weaknesses, sure, and what we view might happen next, rather than talking so much about the politics. So in terms of the strengths, I think that we can talk about the fact that it is very strong in terms of the external balance. So very high levels of FDI, a moderate current account deficit. It did see some currency weakening this year related to election jitters, and also just related to the fact that it has a very high fiscal deficit that needs to be addressed. But it has strong external accounts, huge foreign reserves cushion. So we don't see vulnerability in that area, which is a weakness that will be assessing in other emerging markets. So for Brazil, that's great. Yeah. I think the challenge is on the fiscal side in terms of macro, and it's a very high fiscal deficit, which needs to be reined in order to rein in the very high public sector debt ratio. So I think that means that the next administration will need to take measures, and that's why everyone's talking about the need for pensions reform in Brazil going forwards, and also other measures to narrow the fiscal deficit, because ultimately, even though Brazil has a relatively low level of external indebtedness, and that a lot of the fiscal deficit is covered by domestic debt, yep, ultimately sentiment towards Brazil will turn if those measures aren't undertaken. And I think really for us, actually, as I mentioned before, more broadly about the region, the challenge for Brazil is the politics. And I think the challenge is the fact that there are 30 parties in the lower house of Congress, for example, and almost as many in the Senate. So that's really traditionally been a source of pork barrel politics. So I think it's really the politics, and the question is what happens and how can the next administration enact reform, both in macro policy, but in all of those other structural reform areas that are needed to lower the custo of Brazil. And then, do you want me to talk about Argentina?
We talk about Argentina? Yeah.
So for Argentina, just really briefly, I think we have a cautiously optimistic view, and the reason for that is the huge peso depreciation, which is creating huge economic difficulties for Argentina at the moment, but it's vital. It's really important. It had to happen. The adjustment in May wasn't sufficient, but with the currency adjustment in August, the peso is now competitive. So what we'll see ultimately is an external sector recovery in Argentina from early 2019 that will lay the path for more solid, sustainable growth rates. The risk for us in Argentina is all political, and it has to do with perceptions of long-term investment, because we have an election happening in Argentina in October of 2019, and the question is whether the current administration can continue with policies to keep the economy on the right track.
Right, rather than some sort of fork in the road which might throw your calculations out. Something that you're palpably aware of as a moderator in these circumstances is that nobody is here to hear me. So I'm very happy to open this up to the floor and see whether we can start the first conversation of the day going. Questions? None. Oh, no. Sir.
Thanks. I'm Fidel Tamayo. My question is, how do you see the impact of the Trump administration into Latin America as related to trade?
I I think that is actually one of the biggest risks to Latin America's outlook. And having said all of this about how resilient Latin America has proved this year in the face of tightening global liquidity conditions, it is much more susceptible to any weakening in the U.S. and China. And from our perspective, the risk from U.S. trade policy has to do with the indirect effects on Latin America of a U.S.-China trade war. I do have one slide. I don't know if we can move the slide, but this was just some additional risks to Latin America. And so this is just to emphasize the proportion in only a few of the major economies in Latin America of exports that go to the US and China. So clearly for Latin America, to the extent that a US-China trade dispute results in weaker US import demand or weaker Chinese import demand, that is going to hit Latin America. And in particular, if that has an impact on commodity prices, which it could well have, then that would have an impact on South America's commodity exporters. And we've already seen over the course of the past couple of months that copper prices have fallen, and that's had an impact, for example, on Chile's currency. And then the other question would be whether or not a US-China trade dispute would have inflationary impacts. And if it were to have inflationary impacts and it were to prompt, for example, the Fed to tighten monetary policy faster than we currently expect, then that would raise the risk of faster than expected monetary policy tightening in Latin America that would serve to subdue growth. We are already expecting policy tightening in many of Latin America's major economies. I think Mexico and Argentina are major exceptions where real interest rates there are already very high. But for the rest of Latin America, we see that it will have to move in tandem with the US and it will start to tighten monetary policy next year. That will have a dampening impact. That's already built into our forecast. The risk for us is whether or not we could see the need for much faster tightening in the event of weaker demand, dampening growth, and dampening perceptions of Latin America's prospect.
Any further questions from here? Ma'am.
Fiona, I agree with you that in Argentina the peso needed to be devalued. Do you think there will be further devaluations?
I think we can't rule it out just because of the sort of, when assessing what will happen to the peso in Argentina, I think you have to take into account psychology and history as much as market fundamentals. So I think that we can't rule out further overshooting, but what we can say is that now the peso is at fair value or even slightly undervalued. So I think that there shouldn't, from a fundamental perspective, need to be further adjustment. And I think also the fact that the central bank has introduced a new monetary policy framework and a new exchange rate framework, which is somewhat experimental but seems to be working well. And I think in Argentina's context, where domestic market actors just weren't comfortable with a free-floating peso, this idea of a non-intervention ban that allows for very gradual peso depreciation, which we'll need to continue to see so that inflation doesn't offset the impact of past depreciation. So I think those bans could work well in Argentina's case to keep it competitive without actually producing a lot of overshooting. But you can never tell in Argentina. And I think the issue in Argentina to look out for is that we're going to have a lot of bad numbers, right? So this really tight fiscal and monetary policy means we're going to see a lot of bad economic activity data. We've seen bad inflation numbers, which should prove temporary, but they will also be a source, as we saw in August. That was really the start of that peso run in August. They'll be a source of potential volatility, particularly among domestic market actors. From an international market perspective, I think markets view the peso as where it needs to be, and also the IMF program that is due to be approved by the board to be the right program that needs to be put in place to address the original sin in Argentina, which is fiscal and expansionary fiscal policy, and to tighten policy fast. So I think with that combination of policies, Argentina's medium-term outlook should be good, and we do expect a solid recovery. But you just can never tell with Argentina.
Sarah at the back there. The microphone is on its way. Wonderful.
Neil Perry from Solar Century. You haven't talked much about Mexico, and specifically you haven't talked about Mexican politics. So 2 questions on that. Firstly, do you think that beyond Pemex, which has obviously been slated by the current or incoming administration, do you think they will unravel a lot of the structural reforms that have been put in place by previous administrations? And secondly, referendum didn't work out too well for the UK. Do you think that'll be a good thing for the UK, such as deciding whether to go ahead with a half-built airport or not?
So Mexico, I think the first thing that we have to admit with López Obrador, as with Bolsonaro, is that we don't know. And I think that that's the issue, because historically they may have demonstrated populist leanings and tendencies, and are now presenting themselves more as pragmatists. So I think we have to admit that we don't know for sure. The signals in most areas suggest that AMLO is a pragmatist, and that the policy-making environment could be good. And there's a lot of optimism. I mean, we're optimistic. We know there's a lot of challenges in Mexico that led to this political earthquake. Consumer confidence is extremely high. Business confidence is rising. You know, the new NAFTA deal's just been renegotiated. So I think there's a lot of potential for Mexico, but I think there are still a lot of question marks. And for us, what has been slightly worrying is the team that López Obrador put in place in the energy, including the electricity sector in particular, and those are names that we may consider to have been particularly against the energy sector reforms that were put in place at the start of the Peña Nieto administration. So we were initially worried, but we think it will be a case more of foot dragging and slow progress than a total reversal. So we think, generally speaking, we're cautiously optimistic about Mexico, and we still think its prospects will more or less be tied to those of the US. But I think you've hit on a big risk, and this is something that we have questions about, is how the government will seek to use referendums, how well that will work out for the government. But I think in this case, and in the Latin American context, where sometimes we have seen referendums used by populist governments as a means to bypass institutions and ultimately weaken institutions, that is a real concern for us. So not so much about what the result of the referendum on the airport might be in particular, but how much the government might seek to use referendums and therefore bypass and ultimately weaken institutions, which would be negative for Mexico in the long run.
Something I just wanted to pick up, having begun to mention some more specific sectors, is one that perhaps we'll discuss later on, but food. There are Latin American countries that sit on some of the most fertile land in the world, that are key exporters of all sorts of things, from soybeans to tequila. What scope do you think there is for increasing productivity there, and particularly given that we're in the UK, which we have sort of leading sort of tech and research institutions here, Rothamsted or John Innes or whatever. What opportunities do you think there are for cooperation to sort of bring agricultural technology, perhaps, into Latin America to boost its productivity in that sector? Maybe you don't.
There are huge opportunities. That's certainly the case. One thing that I would point out is that certainly in South America, the agriculture sector is already highly productive, and there have been in many countries real sort of productivity booms in the agriculture sector, in particular, in past decades. So it's a really successful and productive sector in many economies already. There is always more space, and I think that's certainly an area of synergy between the UK and Latin America. I think that's an obvious one, and I think for us, apart from the fact, because we continually have innovation, and I think for us, the issue is that we'll need it, because as we've seen in Argentina, there is a problem with vulnerability to boom and bust related to climate factors. So if there is any sort of innovation to be done in terms of mitigation in that area around climate change, I think that will be really important for Latin America's agricultural producers, because otherwise we'll see that economies will continue to be vulnerable to boom and bust, which obviously isn't ideal.
With ever more people to feed as well. Any further questions on the floor? Manu.
In relation to the Brazilian elections, just about to happen, do you foresee any particular challenges or issues if one or the other candidate win? Or do you think that regardless who wins the election, the challenge will be the same?
I think fundamentally there is one big challenge early on, and that is what markets are looking at, which is the fiscal deficit and the need to reduce the fiscal deficit. So that's a real challenge in the short term, because in the short term, that could produce real volatility and another, at worst, another crisis and recession in Brazil. So that really needs to be resolved. And the question is, who can pass pensions reform, in what form? And the question, therefore, as I mentioned earlier, is about politics, and it's about harnessing Congress. And from that perspective, actually, this is not what we thought would happen up until just before the first round of the presidential election. We thought the governability might be better under Haddad's government than under Bolsonaro. But I think the Bolsonaro wave has become a Bolsonaro tsunami, and politicians from many parties in Brazil would like to ride that wave, and therefore Bolsonaro actually would have better support in Congress, and he looks like he would certainly have a majority, and he would also probably be able to negotiate passage of some sort of pensions reform that would require a larger than a simple majority in Congress. So I think the question is around Congress and how the president, whoever that might be, can harness Congress. I think from a market perspective, there are concerns about a Haddad government and whether or not Haddad would be captive to the hard left of the PT. But I think there are also questions around a Bolsonaro government, because there are questions about how much space and how much maneuvering Paulo Guedes would have, the free marketeer that is Bolsonaro's economic advisor, how much space he would actually have to implement policy, and maybe some concerns around, for example, the truck drivers' strike in May, where Bolsonaro came out, publicly supported the strikers, and those subsidies had to be put back in place, which ultimately is negative for Petrobras and negative for the fiscal deficit. So really some concerns or question marks anyway about potential populist tendencies and policymaking under Bolsonaro, but also a lot of potential because, as we understand, he is an admirer of Trump and wants to use the Trump playbook. And in many ways, probably in most ways, that won't work in Brazil because its economic situation and institutional situation is very different. But in terms of the Custo Brazil and regulation, if there is a shift, a successful effort to lower the Custo Brazil by lowering red tape and lowering the tax and regulatory burden, then that could actually help Brazilian growth rates to really take off.
If I could just ask something that the minister touched upon, is the changing demographic of Latin America. And I wonder if with particular reference to the labour force, you could give some indication as to what's going on. Proportion of graduates, proportion of working age people. What's the outlook there?
So I think we've seen some pause in this huge demographic shift in Latin America, which I think everyone will know has been the rise of the middle class in big countries like Brazil, but all over Latin America. And the minister, again, talked about this. And that brings with it policy challenges because this new middle class has higher expectations for public services. So, traditionally, many countries in Latin America have had high rates of tax collection, but that hasn't translated into, good outcomes and outturns in terms of health and education provision. So that's really the challenge for Latin America. But I think the other challenge is to recognize that this demographic dividend in terms of the labor force for Latin America will not last forever. So we do long-term forecasting out to 2050, and our models for most countries in Latin America is clear that the contribution of labor to GDP growth in Latin America will be much lower in 15, 20, 25 years' time than it is now. So this is an issue and a challenge that needs to be addressed now with those policies, as I've said before, to increase productivity, those sort of labor, tax, infrastructure reforms and investment that are required to boost productivity. So that really needs to be addressed now with the demographic dividend that there is now in order to prepare for what's coming 15, 20 years down the road.
Further questions from this side? So.
Victoria, good presentation. Thank you very much. I represent the City of London Corporation, and 2 or 3 times you touched on pension reform. Could you elaborate what you might see as a positive in terms of that pension reform? And if there might be any challenges, what those challenges might be?
So to sort of provide the context, the fiscal deficit in Brazil is extremely high and it needs to come down. And some reform measures have been put in place to allow that to happen, but they're not actually workable if current expenditure trends on Social Security and pensions continue. So really, the public finances are not sustainable unless pension reform is undertaken. For example, a cap on expenditure is unworkable in the Brazilian context where you have a lot of earmarked expenditure, so spending that goes to specific things under specific rules, so you don't have a lot of discretion in how you allocate spending or how much you cut it, right? Because it's based on those rules. So that being the case, those rules need to change. And one big area that will only increase as a challenge and a problem for Brazil is pensions reform. So the question is political, and it's how it can get passed. And there might be an ideal pensions reform that might be proposed by Paulo Guedes, but politically, it's very difficult to get that ideal pensions reform passed in Brazil, as in any country in the world, right? So there will be a negotiation, and it might not be ideal, but as long as it is, a substantive improvement, that will be good for Brazil. And our view is a positive one about the ability of Bolsonaro, assuming that he is elected, to actually get something done, riding that wave of support initially, assuming that's what he chooses to do first, which is one of the things he should do first, that he will be able to get some form of pensions reform passed. And really, that's just a broader question about debt sustainability and avoiding Brazil falling into another crisis and a recession.
Fiona, it's been a very interesting conversation, which I'm sure will continue over coffee and further panels, but we are out of time for now. Thank you very much for very interesting comments.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.